I said to my colleagues one day in the editorial room, why do we seem to have a double standard? And there was a terrible silence, and I realized at that moment that I'd crossed a line. I had no idea what the line was or why I'd crossed it, but I realized I'd stopped being one of them and I'd become one of you.
I'm Dave Rubin, and this is the Rubin Report. As always, guys, click that subscribe button on YouTube, and don't forget to tap that notification bell so you're alerted of our new videos. And joining me today is a journalist, author, and columnist for the Times of London, Melanie Phillips. Welcome to the Rubin Report.
Thanks, Dave. Very good to be with you.
I'm glad to have you, because I mentioned to you right before we started here that for about 2 years, I've been getting emails and tweets and Facebook messages and all sorts of things. People saying, you got to talk to this Melanie Phillips. Now, you're in Jerusalem now, but you also split time in London. For my American audience that may not know you, can you just do a little Melanie Phillips 101, a little bio before we get into the specifics of your work, your writing, your speaking, your books, that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, I am a British Jew, born and bred in London, of parents who were themselves born and bred in London. Had a fairly conventional upbringing of the type that British Jews in the 1950s had. Parents not very religious, not very observant, but nevertheless belonged to an Orthodox synagogue. I went to Oxford University and read English literature, which fits you for everything and nothing, and fell into journalism. I was trained, though in those days journalists were actually trained, and we were taught things like objectivity and the need to be truthful and the need to be factual and the need to separate fact from opinion. Would you believe such a thing? And I spent 2 years learning all these trade crafts on a local newspaper. In Britain, we have national newspapers. We don't have syndicated columns like you do. But I was on a local newspaper in the suburbs of London, and then went to a magazine, and then went to The Guardian. The Guardian is a bit like the New York Times, but more so. It is the kind of journalistic crucible of left-wing thinking in Britain. And at the time that I went there, I didn't ever really consider myself to be left-wing, but because I wasn't very ideological. I considered myself to be a liberal. Now, I know that the word liberal means something different in America from Britain, but what I meant by that, what I mean by that, was that I thought of myself as an old-fashioned liberal. That is to say, somebody who believes in making a better world by making people, by prioritizing the good that people do over the bad, standing up for the vulnerable against abuses of power, standing up for truth rather than lies. And at that time, I thought that my colleagues at The Guardian and in the left, that we were all on the same side. And we can talk about this in detail, but nevertheless, over the next few years, I realized that this was a big mistake, and that while I still believed in all those things, they were on the other side. They were the people who actually were the oppressors of the poor and vulnerable. They were themselves racist and anti-Semitic. And during this period, which took 10, 20 years, I changed also in the sense that I became more aware of my Jewish background, my Jewish identity. It became more important to me. And I became very, very aware of the enormity of the big lies being told about Israel. Would you believe I'd never been to Israel and never wanted to go until about the year 2000. The year 2000 was the first time I went. And I didn't particularly like it for various reasons. And then within 2 or 3 years, I had bought a place in Jerusalem because my life and my whole view of the world and my view of myself as a British Jew had completely changed. So that's a very short thumbnail sketch of my descent from being the kind of wise child of the left to being the she-devil of the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure how much you know about my story, but I think a lot of my audience is going, Dave, we've kind of heard this before, because that in many ways, although we're not the same age, we're not from the same country, the story that you just told of coming from the left, from a largely Jewish secular family, I mean, it's very much the same story. And I think in many ways our politics and the way you laid out what true liberalism is, really do line up. So can you talk a little bit, because I get this question constantly now, can you talk about when and why you started to see the split within the left towards socialism, progressivism, whatever you want to call it, versus the liberalism that you just described?
Yes, well, there was one particular punctuation mark which really set me on this path, and it was in 1982. And it was when, in a conversation with my colleagues at The Guardian, I was an editorial writer, and I thought of them as being just like me, liberal in the best sense, committed to truth and reason, and decent people. And we had a conversation in which I was very troubled by what at the time seemed to me to be the disproportionate attention being paid to what Israel was doing in its war in Lebanon, which was a controversial war, but it was being portrayed falsely as a war of aggression, whereas I knew, and don't forget I'd never been to Israel and didn't really want to go and wasn't really my thing, but I knew that it was trying to root out the Palestinian Liberation Organization and stop it from attacking Israelis, and the PLO at that time was in southern Lebanon. But it was being represented falsely as a war of aggression, and at the same time, out of the woodwork came unbridled anti-Semitism that we British Jews are all considered to be basically all sticking together in a clannish kind of way and defending Israel. And I was very troubled by this, and I was very troubled by the fact that The Guardian was spending such a disproportionate amount of its time in hurling terrible obloquy at Israel over all this, whereas at the same time, President Assad, the father of the current President Assad, had caused a massacre of his political opponents. Something in between 15 and 40,000 of his opponents were killed over the course of a couple of weeks. And that story didn't really have much traction at The Guardian. I couldn't understand. I was a different person then, didn't really understand what I was dealing with. And I said to my colleagues one day in the editorial room, why do we seem to have a double standard? And there was a terrible silence. And I realized at that moment that I'd crossed a line. I had no idea what the line was or why I'd crossed it, but I realized I'd stopped being one of them and I'd become one of you. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, of course there's a double standard. After all, they said to me, like you, and I became you, and by you they meant Israel, and I'd never been to Israel. Like you, we in the West are brought up to believe in the sanctity of life, respect for human rights, human dignity, whereas people in the developing world are not brought up to believe any of those things. And so if they kill people, we cannot judge them by our standards. That would be racism. And I thought, what? And I said to them, what are you saying? That if one is unfortunate enough to be born and bred into the developing world, then one does not then have the same rights to life and liberty that we do. To my mind, that's racism. And they said, why are you so upset? We do you, and I became you again, the great honor of assuming that you are like us. You have the same moral standards as us. And what's more, you tell us that you, as the Jewish people, are morally superior to us. Now that is A, untrue, and B, it is sheer anti-Semitism. And at that moment, I realized that the assumption I'd made that we were all marching under the same banner of truth and freedom and decency and all those good things, that was untrue. That I was marching under that banner, but they were on the other side. They, the liberals, the left, the people who assumed that because they were the liberals and the left, they embodied virtue, and everybody who was not the liberals and the left was a bad and evil person, they were the racists. They were the anti-Semites. And they believed in lies, and they were irrational.
If you're looking for more honest and thoughtful conversations about the media instead of nonstop yelling, check out our media playlist. And if you want to watch full interviews on a variety of topics, check out the full episode playlist. They're both right over here. And to get notified of all future videos, be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell.